So first of all, I suppose, how suspicious do you think Russians will be that President Putin isn't going to be taking to the ice in Red Square for his ice hockey match that he always does? He's not going to have his great big long rolling Q&A, and he's not going to be making that speech to the Russian parliament, the lower and upper houses of parliament, the state of the nation. How suspicious do you think Russians will be about that?
Well, look, every now and then he does have a tendency to drop out of sight, either because of health issues or else precisely because he doesn't want to tackle some particularly thorny problem. Now, I mean, in this case, these are very sort of high-profile issues. So I think that people will realize that there's something going on. And already the rumor mills are cranking. For some, it's because, again, he's got some kind of health problems. For others, it's precisely because he doesn't want to talk about the war in Ukraine, or that he fears that the Ukrainians are going to launch some kind of basically scene-stealing spectacular. Whatever the reason, though, I mean, I think it just simply emphasizes to most Russians the fact that there is a distinct lack of good news from the war at the moment.
How robust would the questions have been if he had done his usual, Q&A with the media, that 4-hour marathon? Because a lot of them do toss fairly underarm balls, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can be pretty confident that it would have been phenomenally carefully choreographed. There's usually at least a few sort of token Western journalists allowed to ask a question. That might not have happened. But the point is that there comes a point where either you have to address at least some of the issues of the moment, or else actually you begin to look rather weak or indeed quite ridiculous. I think this is the sort of the difficult dilemma. Sure, you can line up someone from the local Omsk courier who is going to ask you, ask Putin, I don't know, what's his favorite type of shoe? We sometimes have these phenomenally banal questions coming. But if you have a 4-hour press conference where no one tackles the questions about the deaths in Ukraine, the fact of this war, when's it going to end, and that kind of thing, let alone the economic problems, then actually you end up weaker than you were before.
Mark, you said the rumor mill was in overdrive, and there are a range of them, aren't they? Including his health. Has he got blood cancer? Has he got thyroid cancer? What about possible escapes to Latin America, possibly Venezuela or somewhere else? Which of these rumors do you think have legs?
I mean, I think that actually the reality is probably pretty simple. It's precisely the fact that actually Putin doesn't want to expose himself to potential ridicule. I mean, the idea that he would be fleeing now, I find that entirely implausible. I mean, at present, he has no threats to his position. Now, that might change. I think there is a certain brittleness. If things go particularly worse in Ukraine and at home, then who knows? And maybe there are contingency plans in place. But to be honest, to head to Venezuela, I mean, putting aside the fact that that's a long journey through essentially hostile airspace, it also is actually heading to a country that looks a lot more fragile, a lot more unstable than Russia itself. So I think we need to treat some of these stories with some caution.
I understand that the Noah's Ark plan, as it's been described in today's Times, might also include a possible evacuation to Argentina, where over the years, quite a number of, let's call them in quotes, rogues have left Europe to settle in comfortably over the years.
Yes, but the thing is, Argentina is not at the moment some particularly sort of a close ally of Russia, let alone Putin. I mean, I think this is the thing, just because in 1945, a depressing number of Nazis seem to have made their way there, does not mean that Argentina is forevermore going to have an open door to any dictators and despots wanting to make their way there. And again, you have this same problem. How do you get there? If things have absolutely collapsed at home, if he is fleeing, presumably with as much of the state treasury as he can squeeze into the back of his plane, well, at that point, he will have lost all state impunities and immunities. And actually sort of forcing down a plane, tracking it down, or then just simply following him with Interpol arrest notices and invitations to war crimes tribunals in The Hague are pretty much inevitable. If he is going to flee, it is going to be to a country that is easy to get to and robust enough that it is willing to ignore international pressure to hand him over. And frankly, it's hard to see any alternative than China.
So China would be the one as opposed to Belarus, where he's headed on Monday to meet his counterpart, Alexander Lukashenko. Um, and let's think about where else it could be. Only China, you think?
Well, look, I mean, there are other countries that he has fairly good relationships with, including the United Arab Emirates and so forth. But again, look, I think the question is, would any of these genuinely stick their neck out for a has-been ex-leader? Putin's strength at the moment is precisely that he's president of Russia. That's it. As soon as he surrenders that, then he's just another guy. And he's another guy precisely with an appointment in The Hague. I mean, this is one of many reasons why I think actually the thought that he would flee seems pretty unlikely. I think actually he is always going to be strongest in Russia. And therefore, I think he's more likely to try and dig his heels in at home than ever flee.
Hence the increasing bombardments of targets all across Ukraine today, and talk of possible escalations in the new year.
Well, look, the Russians have mobilized 300,000 reservists. Now, about 150,000 of them, frankly, they just used as cannon fodder. They've thrown into the battle with almost no training, really just to stop the Ukrainians from taking advantage of the momentum of the moment. But the other half, 150,000, are getting a little bit more training in both Russia and in Belarus. And they're being constituted into new units. Now, let's be honest, these are bad units. They are going to be full of only semi-trained soldiers. Many of the equipment that they'll be issued are basically Soviet vintage things pulled out of old stockpiles. But still, that's 150,000 relatively fresh troops. That said, I mean, this is not probably the kind of force that can launch the kind of massive assault that one would need to, for example, threaten Kiev again. Really, more than anything else, these are the kind of troops he hopes can hold the line, can prevent the Ukrainians from making any more advances, because his strategy is now based on just dragging this war out as long as possible, hoping he can outlast Kiev and perhaps more importantly, outlast the West.
And how do you rate his chances?
I don't think it's going to work. I mean, I think we've seen Ukrainians actually responding even to this current new wave of bombardments, actually with defiance rather than anything else. And likewise, look, in the West, we have a tendency often to get distracted by new crises and go for the short-term political expedient. But at present, there's no real signs of any kind of serious weakening in the will to continue to support Ukraine. But I think the point is, this is really Putin's only chance. He believes in it because he has to believe in it. He has no other real strategy which is likely to actually get him anything like, well, I wouldn't say a victory, but enough that he can spin it as a victory at home.
There's been a lot of talk on social media, analysts and others discussing how this war started, what were the levers, and who made the great mistakes, the great miscalculations. And some have said NATO leaders did, the USA and some of its allies. They didn't really believe that Putin would be as offended as he was from 2014 onwards. And others say it's really Putin and the people around him who made the major miscalculation. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm going to depressingly sit on the fence and say it's a little bit of both. Look, there's no way of getting around the fact that the West has really, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, made a series of blunders in handling Russia. And in particularly, actually, it goes back to the 1990s, when we had a chance to try and help build a genuinely democratic, friendly Russia. And frankly, we missed those chances.
Do you think Putin was actually up for it? He was a guy that the West could do business with, as Thatcher once said of Gorbachev.
No, I don't think so. But I think the point is, if we had handled Russia better in the 1990s, it probably wouldn't have been someone like Putin, a nationalist figure who actually ended up becoming president. But the point is, that's all very well. This is the context, and fine, we could have done other things. But when it comes down to it, absolutely, this is Putin's war. There's no way of getting around it. He believes some bizarre and essentially wrong-headed notions about NATO and its aggressiveness. He doesn't really believe that Ukraine is a real country. He thought this was going to be an easy picking. I mean, he honestly seems to have believed that 2 weeks and the whole war would be over. I mean, in this respect, fine, yes, it is worth looking at the mistakes we made in the West, so that we hopefully don't make them again in the future when, for example, when Putin falls. But at the same time, let's not in any way miss the fact that the absolute responsibility for this and the horrific results is on Putin's shoulders.